have some fun information to go through this week. And what we're going to be looking at tonight are the plagues. And it's great to see you here, Jeff and Cindy. And I think I saw Raylene and Joanne here as well. So great to have you guys here. The context of the plagues. We read it as a story, and like so many other stories in the Hebrew text, it's really stripped of its historical context. It's stripped from the context of other nations. So we really don't see it from a Assyrian perspective when there's contact with Assyria. We don't see it from an Egyptian perspective, even though Israel would have lived there for over 200 years. So with this, we're going to kind of step back in time. And when we look at the Egyptian context with the plagues, they really come alive. Now, a little bit of historical background with this. Remember that the historical setting was that Egypt had been divided into two nations, as often occurred throughout Egyptian's history. You had Lower Egypt, which would have been northern Egypt in the Delta region, that was under the control of a foreign ruler, an Asiatic king who was called a Hyksos. In the south, you had Egypt's legitimate dynasty. You had Kamose and Amose, who were the Theban dynasty, and they were the legitimate heirs to the Egyptian throne. Now, prior to this, perhaps during the wave of immigration, while Joseph was vizier over Egypt, there had been this massive famine throughout Canaan. And this massive famine drove many Asiatics to Egypt for survival, for food, for sustenance, for for work, employment. So this was a migration of immigrants. These immigrants became established within Lower Egypt, and then they began becoming into positions of power, positions of authority. And after about 200 years or so, they really got tired of paying taxes to Egypt, and they established their own government. They overthrew the traditional Egyptian government, and they established their own. So then what you have is this situation of divided Egypt. The northern kingdom, ruled by the Hyksos, then starts taking and levying heavy tribute on the Nile. So this is the background that we have. And we have a very interesting papyrus that refers to a challenge by the king of the north to the king of the south. And what he does is he challenges the Theban god to a duel. And the Theban god would have been Amun-Re. Oftentimes, you didn't have just one deity. You could have Amun-Ra. So you could have Ra, who was the sun deity. He was kind of known as the supreme deity. But you could also have Ammon. You could have Isis. You could have all these different deities that would be fused into one manifestation. So it's nothing to have like Amun-Ra, Ketet, or something like that as a manifestation of that Godhead. Now, in this particular time period, we read later on in Israel's history how they always apostatized to Baal, and how Israel was always very comfortable with Baal. Well, we find that tradition and that comfortable relationship begins as early as Egypt, because in Egypt, the Hyksos worshipped the god Baal. Now, they would fuse him and identify him with the Egyptian deity named Seth. So in Egyptian mythology, you had Ra and the wife Isis, who bore a son whose name in certain periods it's Osiris, and other periods it's Horus. The motif kind of changes over the centuries and the millennia, but the basic motif is that you have the father and the son, and there is a brother. The brother is Seth. Seth becomes this evil deity. He's always trying to kill Osiris or Horus. He is a brother who is just, kind of the prodigal son, where he's gone the other way. So then you have this war between these two sons, and Seth ends up killing his brother Osiris or Horus, and it depends really on the the time period of Egyptian history as to who is playing that particular part. But what is interesting in this scenario is that the Hyksos identify Baal with Seth, with the evil deity, and that is who is worshipped throughout the Hyksos period. And as we read in the scriptures, Israel brings that belief into Canaan with them. They really don't leave it behind in Egypt. And it was really very comfortable for them because you had the Asiatics who were living in Canaan and who already worshiped Baal there in Canaan. So it was a very comfortable scenario for Israel. So then you have this challenge by Apophis, the king of the north, to the king of the south, challenging him, saying, you know, we will see which deity will be with the monarch as protector. And in this duel, it's very fascinating because it is Israel's deity, Israel's God, who kind of answers this call. So in Exodus 12, verse 12, it's very fascinating when Yahweh says, he says, I will execute judgment both on man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgment. I am Yahweh, or Yahovah. So that's kind of an interesting concept. You know, it's not that these deities were real, or that anybody, that whether it be Jehovah or the authors of Israel's scriptures, it's not as though they're recognizing them as legitimate reality deities that existed, but rather they did exist in people's minds. So because they existed in people's minds, it was that idea and that concept that was being challenged and destroyed through the plagues and through the different things that God was doing with Israel while in Egypt. Remember that God had said that the whole reason that he rose up this particularly ignoramus type monarch in Egypt that was very arrogant and very stubborn, he says, I've raised you up to show in you my power, that it should be proclaimed throughout the earth. So those are kind of some backgrounds to the plagues, and understanding those really kind of grant a perspective. Now, just a quick little note about miracles in scripture, because I think that over the medieval period, the ideas of miracles have really degenerated into something that is not just mythological, but very mystical and very superstitious, where this is not the elements that really existed at this time. Miracles exist by some form of very logical, scientific method. We know from quantum mechanics that things that happen in large measure that we would see with the naked eye, those can be manipulated at the quantum level for short periods of time. Well, it is very possible that Yahovah, who created the earth and who has the wisdom and the discretion to create and to order things, possibly also knows how to manipulate, suspend, or to achieve certain things for those miracles to appear to our eyes and to affect us. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about how those miracles happened and what kind of some natural occurrences that occurred just because of the situation, and Yahovah is able to activate already naturally occurring phenomena to accentuate them and to make these miracles occur. So we're going to go through that as we go on. Now, coming back to the Egyptian context, and this is what is really kind of makes the story come alive, because we read the Exodus story as though perhaps it happened all within maybe 1 or 2 months. It doesn't seem like it's a really long period of time. But when we compare it to what we know of Egyptian history and of the Egyptian calendar, we find that the plagues attacked 2 things. Number one, the plagues attacked the naturally occurring Egyptian, the Egyptian agricultural season. So that, it was an attack on the agriculture, but by default, an attack on agriculture is also an attack on the economy, because they didn't have the technology that we have today, where you can make a living off of computer systems or medical technology or anything like that. Their entire society was very agricultural based, as were most societies, because that is simply how you made your living. So the first point of attack, or the first point on which YHWH founded his miracles, or the judgment of Egypt, was on the agriculture. The second was on the astronomical cycle and the deities venerated during that cycle. So for us, whether you live in Japan or Europe or America, most of us follow the the Gregorian calendar, where our new year begins in January and it continues for a solid year. This is called a solar system. It's really kind of a lunar solar, but it's more of a solar because it does adjust every 4 years, and then again like every 400 years, to compensate for the fact that solar years are not exact to the phases around the sun, or the years around the sun. So with this in mind, the Egyptian calendar really sheds quite a bit of light on the progression of the plagues, because what we find is that the plagues attack that particular agricultural activity when it is at the height of its season, and when it can actually do the most damage. We also find that the particular deity's power that is venerated during that month is challenged. You know, it's again ironic, because Apophis had challenged the deities of Egypt to a duel, and here we have YHWH answering, and he challenges each and every deity and in their month in which they are venerated, as far as their power to protect and to preserve the Egyptian and the Hyksos populations. So let me just break down the Egyptian calendar into the seasons and kind of explain how it contrasts with modern calendars. So modern calendars, we recognize 4 seasons. We have a summer, fall, winter, spring. For Egypt, they only had 3 seasons. They had the season of the inundation, they had the season of planting, and they had the season of harvest. This in Egyptian language is called Aket, is the first season. Then you have Peret, which means seed, and Shamu, which literally does mean harvest. So the way that it breaks down is Aket would have gone from July to about November, Peret from mid-November to about mid-March, and Shamu from about mid-April to mid-June. Now, everything in Egypt really revolved around the inundation. So the inundation is a time where, if you look at a map of Africa, and even if you want to right now, just go pull it up on Google Maps. Look at Egypt and where the headwaters of the Nile begin. It begins with Lake Victoria, which is up in the mountains. They get heavy, heavy rains from March, April, May, and those heavy rains take about 2 to 3 months to flow down the Nile until they reach Egypt. Well, when this happens, the water rises and it floods and it inundates incredibly rich farmland. But more than just flooding, it brings with it very important and vital nutrients, soil deposits that replenish the nutrients of the soil and made Egypt's crops some of the richest in the world. And they had just incredible viability, rich nutrition, very fertile, and very easy to grow. However, if the Nile didn't flood for 1 or 2 years, you had massive starvation. So what this meant for Egypt's survival is that the monarchs within Egypt really had to manage the land's resources and the land's food stores with great frugality. So you would have to store against lean years and then supply during those years so that your population did not starve and you didn't face labor shortages and really devastate your economy, not to mention the loss of life. So this is kind of the background that we have with the Egyptian calendar. Now, what clues does Scripture give us as to the beginning of when the plagues started? What's very fascinating with the story of the plagues is that when Moses and Aaron come to Egypt, Israel is at this time when they are making bricks. In fact, when Pharaoh has his authority challenged a little bit, his response is, well, I'm not going to supply any straw whatsoever to the Israelites. They can now go get the straw for themselves. Well, the only time the straw is available in Egypt is really from about June to July. The straw is leftovers from that spring harvest. And the spring harvest occurs anywhere between mid to end of April to mid-May and June, depending on the crop. It begins with flax and then barley, and then it proceeds to wheat and some of the later grains that ripen in June. So when we see this, we can pinpoint a start for when Moses and Aaron began their interaction with Pharaoh, and for when Israel would have worked in the corvée labor force, building Pharaoh's monuments, building his palaces, elaborating and aggrandorizing his temples. So these would have been the time of year that this would have happened. Now, it's very fascinating before Moses comes to Egypt that YHWH tells him something very, very interesting. This is Exodus 7, verses 1 through 3. YHWH tells Moses that he will make Moses like unto an Elohim, like unto God to Pharaoh. So even though Moses comes representing YHWH, the Egyptians would not have really have had an understanding of a singular God with a prophet. That would have been so foreign, they would have conceptualized it and reinvented it and cast it in the light that they could understand. So when you have a physical manifestation of a deity who speaks for the deity, this is something the Egyptians could identify to because it was readily in line with their theology and something they could understand. So when YHWH says, I will make you a god unto Pharaoh, and Aaron shall be your prophet, this is exactly how the Egyptians would have understood Moses's appearance to them, because again, it was part of the innate Egyptian mythology that they were used to functioning in. So the very first month and the very first plague is the water to blood. This occurs, of course, in the season of Aket, and the month is Tiki. Now, within the month of Tiki, the god Thoth, or Dehuchi, is venerated in Egypt. And let me just share with you some things about what this deity. He is known as the deity of magic. He was worshipped at Hermopolis. Even though each deity was worshipped in a particular month, each and every deity in Egypt had its own divine location. So it would have been worshipped in a particular place. So one god might be worshipped in Aviv, another one in On, another one in Hermopolis, and another one in Thebes. You would really have the deities being worshipped at different places in Egypt. So those places, you know, were kind of each of their little holy shrines where you would go and venerate that deity. But even if you didn't live there, you could still venerate the deity and achieve some level of favor from the deity just by recognizing him and offering some sort of offering during that particular month. So he, with Thoth, he could compound magic. He was the one, Pharaoh Apophis challenged the gods to a duel, claiming that Seth had the upper hand and was the most powerful in the land. And then you have that, this aspect of magic in the story where what is the very first thing, even before the river is turned to blood, you have Moses and Aaron compounding magic before Pharaoh with their staffs turning into serpents. We find that Pharaoh's magicians can do the same thing. And what was very fascinating when I was doing my research, I read through Egyptian documents. And when you read through these ancient papyruses, you find ideas that involve the concepts of matter changing into energy and energy changing into matter. It was very interesting to read through that and to find that very modern concept in an ancient Egyptian document. So were they actually able to do this, or was it some manipulation of sight, you know, that we find along, you know, David Copperfield or something like that? we really can't answer that, but we do find that there is some sort of scientific understanding at this early point in time in history. To what extent, I don't know. I have not seen any scholarly articles that pursue it any further, but a few have come out just at least discussing the topic in greater detail. So the other thing that we find within this first month is that after Moses' and Aaron's staffs become serpents, after they eat up the serpents of the magicians, that then later on in the month, Moses turns the water to blood. Now, it's interesting because scripture states that the blood in the water lasted for 7 days. It also states that when you dug trenches away from the actual Nile River and you allowed the water to filter through the banks of the Nile, that it became purified and you could drink it. So this, it seems to be a evidence of some sort of microorganism that is causing a prolific algae bloom, perhaps, within the water. And as a matter of fact, we do find this in Egyptian history, where the Nile at different phases and different stages will actually have this algae bloom, especially right before the inundation. When the water levels are low and the water moves slowly, there's stagnant areas, you can have this this bloom. I believe Simca, if you guys are familiar with Simca Jacobovici, he also covers this miracle and the scientific evidence behind this in his film, The Exodus Decoded. So if you guys haven't seen that, I do recommend that you see it, because it does provide a very good synopsis and a very good overview of how this would have happened. So that was the first month. The second month is the month of Minket. And in this month, you have the god Ptah, who is venerated during this month. Now, Ptah is known as the creator god. He was also the patron deity of skilled craftsmen, and he was known for hearing prayers of those who called. So, you know, in Egyptian mythology, if you're going to cry out to God, it is God who is this Ptah who is going to hear your prayers, and he may, you know, tell the different deities this is this particular petitioner's request and make it known to the particular god whose job it is to handle that particular thing. So if you're wanting a child, he's going to go tell Hathor or Isis, you know, make her fertile or something like that. So he's going to do the delegation. Now, the other deity that is worshipped during this time is the deity Hapi. Hapi is the god of the Nile. Now, remember, Egyptians had gods for everything. You had a god for good health. You had a god for beauty. You had a god for fertility, a god for blessings and good luck and childbirth. You had another god for wealth and prosperity. And so you had really a god for everything. So Hapi was the god of the Nile. And of course, Hapi was very venerated, especially during the season of Aket, the very first season. And so with these, all these plagues, God is challenging not only the deities of that particular agricultural season, but also the deities that are worshipped in relationship to that agricultural season. So by turning the water to blood, by making frogs come out of the water, he is challenging Hapi, the god of the Nile, to that, you know, not even Hapi can protect you. Yes, the inundation may occur. Yes, these other things may happen, but look, you know, Israel's God actually controls Hapi. So for the Egyptian mindset, this is how they would have seen these different phenomenon occurring in their land during this season. So the next, and let me just give you a breakdown. So we've gone from June, mid-June, I'm sorry, we've gone from mid-July to mid-August, which is when Aket would have occurred, and when the very first month of the Egyptian calendar would have occurred. At the beginning, there is no inundation. By the time we get to the end of this period, the inundation has occurred, waters are rising. So when you have these waters rising, it really provides a firm breeding ground for frogs, because you have pools of water everywhere, and you can have a a very productive and a very active production year just because of the number of water sources that are available. So it's no accident that we find that frogs occur during this month. Now, this brings us up to about the mid-September is where this has happened. So then we have the next month, which is Knet Het Hurt. Now, Knet Het Hurt is what we modernly call Hathor. She is the female goddess. She is, in modern terms, we would call her the Aphrodite. We would call her the Venus. She is the fertility goddess. She has love, sexuality, fertility. All of these things are part of her. Now, Hathor in later times becomes identified as Isis. So, these deities kind of merge and they evolve over time, and they take on new names under different dynasties as the priesthood reinvents the previous gods and kind of brings them up to date to modernize them. Now, what's fascinating with this, with Hathor, is that during her month, we find that there is, actually, let me back up just a minute, because remember, up to this point, we have found that that Thoth, his ability to create, his ability to control magic has been challenged. And then in the next month, we find that Minket, who is, and also Ptah, who is the god of skilled craftsmen. At each point in time, we find that these gods are being challenged. So for Hathor, we find that she is venerated, of course, as this loving goddess. But then all of a sudden, and this is very uncharacteristic for the iconography and for the mythology in Egypt, because Hathor all of a sudden degenerates into this wicked, bloodthirsty goddess, Sekhmet. And Sekhmet, who is venerated in the next month, becomes this bloodthirsty god that begins to kill Egyptians and whose thirst is never quenched. So it's very fascinating. So it's really difficult to separate the second and third plagues in this context, and by extrapolation, the second and third months, because they kind of evolve one into the other. So in the second month, you have frogs, and in the third month, you have lice. Now, there's some question with the lice, the plague of the third month, as to whether it is modern lice or whether it is some sort of pest that would have gotten in your skin, maybe fleas or something like that, and really would have made life miserable. Something that perhaps would have sucked blood and could even have transferred disease to one extent or the other. So you find that the height of the inundation, it's the point where the Nile would reach its highest and it would crest, would have been somewhere between mid-September and mid-October. So this again, if you have mosquitoes or something that is a waterborne insect, if you had an unusually high inundation level that would have flooded crops and had stagnant water there for maybe 2 months, you could see where very, very quickly, within 2 to 3 weeks, I mean, some of these insects will breed and reproduce within 24 hours. And you get a whole population of maybe 2 or 3 different species reproducing, and you can have plagues and outbreak very, very quickly in this particular situation. Now, other people identify these as a gnat. As far as this lice, and these were a gnat that is, we think of gnats as being pesky in the United States, but they actually have these other species of gnats in the Middle East where they really bite and sting. They sting very badly, and they do indeed suck blood in some of these instances, depending on the species. So you find that in the next month, the fourth month, where it goes from lice or gnats into flies, that Hathor, the loving goddess, the one that is a favorite among women, she is the loving protector deity, all of a sudden transcends into this angry, vengeful, bloodthirsty Sekhmet. And in this month, we find that not only is she venerated, but we find that, is in this concept, perhaps, or in this context, that we find the Egyptian mythology of the destruction of mankind, where the water turns to blood, and Ra has to trick her into coming and drinking the wine and becoming drunk, so that her love for destruction is subdued. Now remember, the reason why she had a thirst for blood in the beginning was because mankind had rebelled against Ra, the creator god, in the Delta region. So she is specifically targeting this region. At least that's how it is presented within the destruction of mankind, that particular story. So then from the mosquitoes and the flies, we enter into a new season. So the first season of Aket has ended, and now we go into the season of Peret. Peret is the season of growing, and now that you have no crops that are growing. Everything is flooded. The Nile is now receded to the point where it is not so much of an issue. So now this is the time in the Egyptian agricultural season where you have calving, and where the focus shifts to animals and husbandry, whether it be cattle, goats, sheep, all of those types of activities. So now the plague attacks. It's a meringue on cattle. So it's not by accident that we find the plagues following Egypt's natural agricultural season. Now, the deity that is deified in this month is the male deity Min and the female deity Mut. And they are considered to protect the agricultural during the season. This was an important time for Egypt because from mid-November to mid-December, especially as we get into December, this is where Egypt planted all their crops. They would plant them for them to mature and for them to be harvested somewhere between April and May. So again, just notice this progression of the plagues focusing on agriculture as we go on. Now I'm going to catch this comment real quick. Sharon says, I don't know how new this is, but now there is lice called chewing lice, and that can't be killed by Steyr, made that sterile products, but need prescription from a doctor. Yeah, this is really fascinating. When you study immunology, whether it doesn't matter if it's an antibiotic, it doesn't really matter if it is a pest of some sort. You find that the more we do, whether it's pesticides that we use, you find that bugs, whether they be bacterium or pests such as fleas, they really become resistant. So all that we end up doing sometimes is creating stronger super bugs that are harder to kill. And then you have to create stronger products that have more potential harm for those of us that use them. So yeah, so there's a big question as to the best way to eradicate these types of pests that occur. Zika is another prime example, and the issues that is producing. There's been some people that have argued that is a consequence of Monsanto engineering. There's other people that say, well, this is just a natural mutation in the environment. I really haven't seen conclusive proof either way, but it is something that still raises many questions. All right, so the next month is going to be the 6th plague. And in this plague, and let me make sure, because we got up to 4 plagues. So we're on the 5th plague now. I'm sorry, we did the 5th plague, which was the murrain of cattle, and now the 6th plague is boils. So from mid-December to mid-January, you do not have any agricultural activity. This is Egypt's month of resting, month of where just nothing goes on. You've planted your seed is germinating, your cattle have calved, you have all your new babies. So you're really not left with anything agriculturally that, a God who is really showing his power and who is reaping destruction on all of the gods of Egypt. you really don't have anything that is venerated in that regard during this month. So what is it that Yehovah attacks? Well, he focuses on humans. So this is where we find boils occurring. Now, the god that is venerated in this month is the god Aset. She was the deity who tricked Amun, Ra-Amun, into revealing his secret name. Now, let me give you a little history behind this story. In Egyptian mythology, and this story really becomes very popular the later we get in Egypt's history, but it dates from a very early period, from at least the Old Kingdom. So in this story, Ra has many names. He may manifest as Ammon, he may manifest as Ta or Thoth, or any number of deities he can manifest in some sort of divine form. So, but there's one God that there's one name where if this one secret name is found, then you kind of almost like Samson in a way, kind of the story there, where if you can find this one secret name and you can use it, you can actually gain control over Ra and almost make him your subject by using this divine name and commanding him to do your heart's bidding. So in this particular story, Aset tricks Ra into revealing this divine name that is so holy that it is never to be spoken. So she tricks him, he reveals it to her, and then she gains the upper hand. And you do find her sometimes vying for him with popularity during subsequent periods. So this is kind of the background between that story. So what is fascinating during this period as far as agriculturally, there's really no agricultural product to target, so the plagues shift to boils and they attack humans, and they also attacked the animals with these boils. Now, it says that the magicians could not create this magic and they could not prevent this magic. So again, God is continually attacking all these deities of Egypt. He's challenging their power to be able to do the things that they claim, and he's rendering them impotent and showing that they cannot recreate these. Now, the seventh plague, which occurs from mid-January to mid-February, this is going to be the month Raka Najuls. The seventh plague is where we have hail, thunder, lightning, and frost. So this would have been a time for Egypt where you're going to have very mild weather normally. Your lows are going to be 55, your highs are going to be 70s. It's going to be very mild temperatures. So to have frost, and King David is the one who says that there was frost during this event. I believe it's Psalm 78. Is very uncharacteristic. Now, the god venerated in this month is Ammon. He is known as the invisible creator god, the hidden one, behind and in all things, a deity too complex to describe in one name and even to depict in his true form. Therefore, another name that he was called was he who abides in all. So again, it's challenging this ability's hiddenness, and maybe manipulating it. There was a lot of phenomena that occurred during this period of time that were felt by the people. They were not hidden in any way. So remember what we studied as far as historical causation for some of the plagues. This is right when we find Thera or Santorini in the Mediterranean, which is a super volcano. This is right when it would have started erupting, or at least precursor to that final eruption. Recent studies of volcanoes have shown that prior to eruptions, they will emit gas from their lava chamber. And this gas released into the atmosphere can produce very, very violent storms. I lived in Washington State when Mount St. Helens blew, and I can tell you that whole entire year before Helen blew, there was nothing but rain almost every single day. And it was just this dreary, drizzly rain, but in other places you would just have these uncharacteristic downpours that perhaps were a result of the gas interaction with the different layers of the atmosphere that would produce condensation, and therefore you would have greater storms than what you would normally have. If archaeologically, we find that Memphis had flooded at this point in time, and we find that it flooded at the exact point in time in history where Scripture places the Exodus, which would have been right around 1550, 1548 BCE. And the reason we know this is because you find that there's a 13th dynasty context below the layer that shows flood. There's Hyksos layers below that. And above that, you have an 18th dynasty context, which would have been the context after the Hyksos would have been driven out of Egypt. The 18th dynasty succeeded them under Mose and started rebuilding and restoring. We're also told in various documents by Mose, by Hatshepsut, that the temples and the deities were destroyed during this period of time, and that the mortuary tombs were plundered during this point in time. So there's a lot of overlay that if you're just reading it and not taking into context the possibility that this could be the background of the Exodus, you're really going to miss it. But when you put all the pieces together, you see that they really present different views of the same event occurring at the same time. So you find that, again, this is where Moses' storm stele, where it talks about the flooding that occurred, that probably was caused by Thera's eruption. Now, we do find also in the delta regions, we find ash deposits from Thera. Those deposits do date about 50 years earlier to about 1625 or 1623. So there is that question of a 50, 70-year period as far as how it aligns chronologically. Now, YHWH tells us that this seventh plague hit the very heart of Egypt. Exodus 9:14 says, "For at this time I will send all my plagues on your heart and on the hearts of your servant." The reason this plague was particularly disastrous, unlike any other plagues, is that this plague, with the thunder, the lightning, and the frost, it hit the very heart and soul of the Egyptian economy. This is when you started having the flax beginning to mature. And flax was so important, it was so vital for Egypt's economy. Because of the very rich soil Egypt had, they could produce strains of flax that you would wove into like a cotton-like substance. It was linen, but it was the most softest and subtle linen that you could find anywhere in the world. Kings from Cyprus, kings from Greece, kings from Assyria, all these wealthy, wealthy people would buy and trade for Egypt's flax, for the linen that product made, because it was just so incredibly comfortable and durable as well. So to attack and to cause the flax to be devastated at this point in time just really hit the heart and soul of Egypt tremendously, because it was their economy. And then it was also their own sustenance as well, because they would use it for themselves as well. And I'm just going to read from page 494 real quick. It says, "From all accounts, scriptural and Egyptian sources, the seventh plague was the most devastating for Egypt. This was the storm that appears Mose had called an all-reckoning storm, the result of a duel between the gods," which is what Mose states. Perhaps in part a reference also to Apophis' challenge. In order to appreciate the economic impact of this plague, we need to step back in time and see how essential flax was to the viability and culture of Egypt's economic prosperity. So Egypts were a highly technical people. They knew that flax differed between one week and another. So your early flax, when you would harvest it early, was your softest. The longer you let it go, you would use it for different types of products. If you let it go to the very end of its season, say you would wait all the way to the end of maybe mid-April, that it got very coarse, very hard, and that was the type of flax that you used to make rope for ships, or sails, or things like that. So the Egyptians were very, very smart with their agriculture, and they used it for, great economic prosperity for the entire nation. So we find that, again, the god that is challenges in this month is Ammon, and he was the idea of his hiddenness that is challenged with the thunder and the lightning that occurs during this time. Now, also of interest is the timing, and Egypt's agricultural cycles differ from that of Israel. Egypt's agricultural cycles occur about 3 weeks earlier than Israel. And this is what one of the authors that studies agriculture in Egypt states. It says, the barley is ripe about the end of February or beginning of March. The wheat, the end of March or beginning of April. Consequently, the plague of hail occurred at the end of January or at the latest the first half of February, so that there was at least 8 weeks between the 7th and 10th plagues. This is fascinating then this is Carl Friedrich Kiel. It's very fascinating that he states this, because this is right in line with what we are seeing with the plagues following the Egyptian agricultural seasons, as well as the Egyptian calendric seasons. It's just amazing how you cannot attack the flax and the barley in December before they begin to mature. The fact that this follows, we saw that it began in June and July prior to the inundation, continued through the inundation, all the way through December, when there is no agricultural product, it's boils on humans, and then we go into the flax and the barley from January to February. So we see this direct correspondence between the plagues and the Egyptian agriculture and calendric cycles. Now, the next plague, this is going to be the 8th month and the 8th plague. It's YHWH. And this was the month that venerated the Egyptian goddess Renutit. And she was the lady of the land, the lady of granaries. So it was her job in Egyptian mythology, to ensure bountiful harvest, the protection of granaries against pests that would invade them. And it was also her deity to make sure that everything ripened, that it matured to its fullest potential. So again, it was during her month where everything in Egypt just begins to ripen. You may have another 4 weeks left until the actual harvest of a lot of products, but pretty much everything is growing up, even though it may not be ready for harvest. So now the plague that attacks is a plague of locusts. You can't have a plague of locusts that attacks. Scripture says that it attacked the flax that was maturing and the barley, and it really devastated Egypt. So this again corresponds to the cycles that we are seeing. The harvest season in central Israel runs about 3 weeks later than Egypt. And we find this from the 10th century Gezer calendar, which describes the harvest season in Israel. And we find that the cycles that it describes are very similar to Egypt, just off by about 3 weeks. The next one that we find, Shamu, which is harvest. This is where we find the 3 days of darkness. Now, this would not be a correspondence to an agricultural season at this point, because darkness, 3 days is probably not enough to make your crops wither away from not having sun, although it could affect their ability to fully mature and to fully ripen, simply because the sun and the duration of sunlight actually causes plants to secrete a hormone. And this hormone that arises from daylight actually causes them to mature and to reach a very bountiful state. So in some ways, the days of darkness may have affected that. But if it's just about 2.5 days, maybe 3 days of darkness, it could be debated as to how much ill effect that had on Egypt, other than the fact that it showed the power of God, and it made the Egyptians, and played on their superstitions and really made them afraid. So in this month is the month of Kansu Hesed Abu, and he was known as the keeper of the books of the end of the year. It was his job during his month, the deity's job was to determine who would live and who would die during the upcoming year. So it was, kind of, in Christian circles and even Jewish circles, you're used to hearing the concept of being written in the book of life. Well, we have the exact opposite concept in Egypt, where you're actually written in the book of death. So if he wrote your name in the book of death that year, then your life would expire before his month rent came around, or perhaps before the next inundation during that next year. So he was also known, and this is key, as the god of the night. And that's, that would be the god of the night season, where Ra was the god of the day. And he made sure that the sun arose every morning and that it set every night. Excuse me. Kansu was the god of the night, and he made sure that the night passed safely by. Well, here we have in the story of the Exodus, in his month, not anybody else's month, but in the month that he is venerated, we have a renegade Kansu who all of a sudden night is extending beyond its normal 12 or 11-hour period, and it is extending for 2.5, 3 days. So again, God is rendering all of the gods of Egypt as chaos, something that was totally, like, for us, we can say certain acts or certain abuses of power are evil. If you look at perhaps, priests' abuse of powers with younger boys, we'll look at certain things and we'll say that it is utterly wicked, is very perverse. For Egypt, their idea of perversity, their idea of absolute wickedness was the idea of chaos, of breakdown of the social order. That was just the most detrimental thing in the worldview of ancient Egyptians. So to have Kansu, who all of a sudden somehow be manipulated to a 2-day period of darkness during the month in which he is venerated, God is fulfilling this challenge of challenging all of the gods of Egypt to a duel, and rendering each and every single one of them impotent and subject to the Israelite God and his greater power. Now, it's very interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and read this real quick. I'm on page 499 if you guys want to follow along. It says, in his form, Kansu Hesed Abdu, he was known as keeper of the books of the end of the year, possibly attesting to an earlier Egyptian calendric system in which the new year coincided with the spring or vernal equinox. Both Richard Parker and Leo Deput, who are the foremost scholars on the Egyptian civil calendar, they have demonstrated that Egypt's original calendar was indeed lunar based. Deput successfully demonstrated that the last lunar month prior to the astronomical new year was a straddle month in which the New Year's Day occurred in the last month of the year. The first new moon after the astronomical solar year marked the first month of the new year. So what this basically means is that, Egypt, like many societies, they updated their calendar after so many centuries. So the original Egyptian calendar was totally lunar based, but it did have some solar accountability, where your new year did not begin until after the vernal equinox. This was the system that was used in Mesopotamia, and as we'll see, it was also the system that God established with ancient Israel, with the New Year calendar that God gave to them. Then what happened somewhere in the late Old Kingdom period, New Kingdom period, we're not really sure where, but somewhere in that maybe 300 to 400 year range, Egypt invented a civil-based calendar, which was strictly solar based. You had 12 months of equal 30-day months. So you had 12 months of 30 days. And then you had these, I think it was eight epigemal days at the end of the year because it didn't match up totally with a solar year. Now, we know that it really was off, and in later points in time in Egypt's history, the seasons became very out of place and very disconjointed, where you could have what would normally be a winter month, say in June, because those days were so far out of sync with an actual solar year. Now, traditionally, the Egyptian New Year didn't just begin with the inundation, but it also began with the rising of the star Sirius in the east. And it would, the moment that it rose right before Venus marked the beginning of the new year for them. So we don't know whether the Egyptian priest, whether they would delay and postpone the season until they saw this and just leave a period of undetermined time. That's highly unlikely. It is much more likely that they began the new year with this rising of the star in order to keep the seasons in sync. Now, the 10th plague that occurs in Kanet Petri is the last one. And as you know, that of course is the most devastating. This was the month in which Horus was venerated. Remember, in later times, Horus becomes Osiris. He is Egypt's most famous and universally venerated deity. He's known as the god of kingship. He is the one that struggles against the Egypt god Seth for the power of Egypt's throne. So again, God is challenging his power, challenging his ability to protect Egypt's firstborn, as well as challenging the idea as to who would and would not be written in that book of death for the upcoming year, you know, because God obviously put a whole lot more people in there than what were originally there, according to the Egyptian mindset. They couldn't have fathomed a deity being so renegade as to just go out and arbitrarily slaughter a whole bunch of their population. So this, again, was challenging the power and authority of Egyptians. Now, I want to back up for just a minute. We've looked at all the plagues. So the last plague that occurs, the 10th plague, is the 10th month of the Egyptian calendar. And this occurs from mid-April to mid-May. And this is very important to consider when we begin discussions of the Hebrew calendar in the month of Aviv. Because when Yahweh says to Moses, this shall be the beginning of months to you. Now, this is the month of Aviv. This is right with the, it occurs between mid-April and mid-May. So the idea of a very early new year is really an idea that is foreign in the historical context. And the reason also that I say this is that there is a Hebrew term called Tukafat Hashoshana. And this term is variously translated as turn of the year, end of the year, and it refers to the spring equinox. It can also refer to the fall equinox. We find cognates, in other words, we find very similar words used in Ugarit and also used in Mesopotamia to describe the exact same concept of a turn of the year. And the reason the ancient civilizations would call this the turn of the year is because the sun would go around and, you know, your days would get shorter and shorter and shorter and then longer. And once you hit that equinox, your equinox marks the time of the year where your daytime and nighttime are equal. And once you hit that time, you knew that you were going into the summer months and you were entering a new season. But they would not allow the new year to begin before the equinox. So what you find with this term, whether we look in Mesopotamia, Ugaritic text, or in Israel, you find that you had the spring equinox, and your year would begin with the first visible new moon after the vernal equinox. Now, just as an example, the last 2 years, like 2015 and this year, 2016, have been some of the earliest years that you can have. As a matter of fact, last year in 2015, you actually had the vernal equinox and the new moon occurring on the same day. But that equinox always occurs right around March 21st. So March 21st is really the earliest day that you could ever begin your new year, because you had to have that spring equinox first, and then you would begin your month. Now, the latest the new year could begin would be around April 20th, April 21st. And that just means, your Sukkot is going to be very late in October, perhaps even as late as a very early November in very rare cases. But what you find is that this kept the agricultural seasons in sync. Because by and large, sometimes I don't know if you guys have watched this, but sometimes you can have earlier spring harvest, sometimes you can have late. They're usually within a couple weeks of each other, but some years are sooner and some years are later. And this is often because it is actually following this default calendar where the lunar begins after the equinox, and the agricultural cycles seem to be in sync with these lunar solar phases. And I say lunar solar because the equinox is a solar event, whereas the months are the lunar event. And it just appears from the research that I have done that they do indeed are in sync with this, and they follow the same type of cycle. So YHWH, in the calendar that he established for Israel, he did establish a calendar that was compatible with Mesopotamia, and the one that Egypt would have originally followed before her calendar was reinvented, say, under the 18th dynasty. Now, let me just say a moment about the time and setting of the Exodus and the path of the Exodus. A very interesting statement that YHWH makes is that Israel could not leave Egypt by the ways of the Philistines, even though that way is near. Now, in prior times, prior to the 12th century BCE, this way of the Philistines was called the Way of Horus. It was a highway. It was a beaten path that went from the Egyptian Delta, far north Egyptian Delta, all the way into Canaan. And it was a highway where you could have some water spots, places for fresh water for your caravan, so you could be refreshed and make the journey. Saying that Israel could not depart because they may see war if they took the way of the Philistines, that makes no sense whatsoever in the time period of Ramses, where you have Ramses garrisons throughout Egypt. And you also have them in the Delta and in the Negev. So that really doesn't make any sense, because Israel could have faced war anywhere, even in Canaan, because Ramses had garrisons in Canaan. But if we go back in history 250 years or 300 years to 1548 BCE, the political situation is such that statement makes complete sense. And this is why. You find that Apophis, the king of the north, and Kamose, the king of the south, were at war. So you have this civil war that is brewing within the land. We know that Kamose had traveled up the Nile. He had captured Heliopolis. He had captured On. And right at this point in time, there's the Rhine mathematical papyrus, and we discover that that Kamose has just captured Tajaru, which has later become Seal under the Greeks. Tajaru was the main port city that you had to pass through to walk on the way of the Philistines, to walk on that highway. You really couldn't just go any place you wanted. Egypt had learned with these waves of immigration that their land could be invaded and their economy destabilized. So they had built this wall along its border there in the Sinai Peninsula, where right from Tajaru all the way down for several hundred kilometers, it would be, you had armed garrison and this wall that was about 30 feet high that prevented people from just coming into Egypt at will. Egypt regulated their immigration so that it was controlled, so that chaos did not ensue. So, but to go on this highway and to enter into it, you had to pass through Tajaru. And had Israel tried to escape through that route at this particular point in time, they would have faced an enemy army, armed forces ready for a battle that would not allow Israel to escape. So they would have seen war. And we know how fickle Israel was at the first sight of adversity. They were really just wanting to tuck their tail between their legs and go running back to Egypt. And so this makes perfect sense within this context. One of the last points, I have two more points that we'll cover tonight or this afternoon. One of the last points is the Exodus route. There's two very viable possibilities. The first takes you through the Straits of Tiran, where you find that many of the places, the geographical places that are mentioned along the Exodus route, you find that those fit the qualifications, whether it's the Migdal and the Etam and the Baal Zephron. You find all of those places very much being in line with the geography that we find to even today in this region. You find that there is an underwater land bridge that at low tide is like knee deep, that Israel could have walked on. They wouldn't have had to go down into a valley, wouldn't have had to come back up. It would have been a straight path that Israel could have walked on. So that's the first possibility. The second possibility, and this is the one that the producers of Patterns of Exodus, if you guys are familiar with this is the one that they are embracing, and there's good evidence for it also being Nuwabi Beach. This was also the route which oh, why is his name escaping me? The biblical archaeologist, maybe it'll come to me in a minute. I'm having a brain freeze at the moment. But this was the route that he endorsed before his death back in the 80s and 90s. And that's Nuwabi Beach. And I have both of those routes shown on page 506 as possibilities. Both of those lead to Jebel El Musa in Saudi Arabia. So it doesn't matter which way you come at it, you really end up at the same place, regardless of the Exodus route. And those really shed some light on the historical. So when people say that there's no evidence, we actually do have some geographic evidence that is very strong for what is there. Water archaeology is now taken off. It's really taken off in like the last 5 or 6 years. And that science is now also leading to our understanding, because you have archaeologists that can dive, they can take photographs, and they can look at the artifacts that are preserved at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, and be able to project a possible Exodus route from those artifacts. Now, in closing, I want to reiterate about Apophis. It's very fascinating with this renegade king in northern Egypt, who is really an anomaly for Egypt. They hadn't seen a king like this in all of their history. He really was out for himself, and he was out for the Asiatics, had no love of the Egyptians. But it was custom. And one thing you do not do in Egypt is break with custom and tradition. So you find that even in this, the priests are still going to venerate Apophis. But what's fascinating with the way that they venerate him is that he becomes associated with unexplained darkness, earthquakes, thunderstorm, and utter chaos. I had mentioned previously how he's like the Greek Hydra. No matter how many times you kill him, he keeps coming back. But it's fascinating, this deity did not exist anywhere in Egyptian history before the Hyksos period. And he's really just comes into life during the 18th dynasty, where he is reinvented to explain away and to rationalize so many of the events that occurred in Egypt's history during this time. So that concludes some of the evidence for the Exodus. I do invite you guys to go ahead and consider the archaeological evidence, the written evidence that we have. We talked about those in previous classes. And next week, we're going to get into the evidence for the Canaan conquest. Now, let me say, we will not be having class next week. We are going to be attending a function in St. Francisville with Roots of Faith. I invite each of you to join us. It's going to be a great event. So we will meet in 2 weeks, back to Friday night, although I may see some interest as to, for the summer months, whether Friday evenings or Shabbat afternoons work better for everyone. I may set up a poll and see what works best. But what we're going to do is look at the Canaan conquest. And my goal is to become very technologically advanced, because I want to share with you guys through the screen sharing option that YouTube offers some of the charts and some of the evidence that we have from Canaan. And this is where the evidence just becomes absolutely convincing. Not self-convincing in any way, but it's really hard to explain away the massive archaeological evidence that we have that aligns directly with the chronology Scripture has given to us within the story of the conquest of Canaan by Israel. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for comments. I appreciate you guys spending your Shabbat afternoon with us, or with me. And any comments or questions, I would love to hear them. This is always a fun session, and it's fun to discuss, and I appreciate spending this time with you guys. So any comments or questions? And the other thing that I think we may have by next week is we are upping our internet capabilities. So maybe we'll have even a better screen resolution next week. So any comments or questions? All right. If not, I will go ahead and close it out. And again, I appreciate you all being here with me and spending your afternoon, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And please do join us next week for the Roots of Faith function. Okay, Sharon says, are you going to cover the slaughter of the lambs? Yes, let me go. That's good to cover. You know, the slaughter of the lambs associated with Pesach that occurs before Israel exoduses Egypt. In my studies, I have found that every time you have a ritual slaughter, it is usually associated with covenant making. So remember, when Israel goes to Mount Sinai and they covenant with God, there really is no slaughter of any animal. You find that Israel kind of seals their covenant with God before they exodus Egypt. You know, you might see some symbolism in there, but they really do seal that covenant. And the way that you did this traditionally is you would take an oath above the animal you were about to slaughter and say, may whatever, you would make an agreement. And then you would say, if me and my descendants do not uphold every word of this agreement to do them, then may what happens to this animal happen to me and my descendants. It was termed a self-implicating sacrifice. So this, whether Israel would have understood this, because in their culture, they understood that that is what ritual slaughters were. So when God asked them to slay the lamb, to put the blood on the doorpost, Israel would have understood this as this ritual covenant-making process. Because remember, for 6 months, Moses has been asking Pharaoh, let us go out into the wilderness that we may worship and covenant with our God. And, you know, Pharaoh is continually denying this ability. So Israel would have understood that. So they agree to this covenant before God actually ratifies it with them or tells them even the terms of it. They may have had some sort of loose understanding that was what it would have been. You know, Moses very well may have been able to shed some light on what the agreement would have been, but you know, we're not given that behind the scenes information. So I don't know if that answered your question, Sharon. If you had something different in mind, please let me know. Thank you, Cindy. It's so great to have you here, and thanks for all that you're doing. I don't know if you guys are following Cindy on Facebook or not, but she has some really sweet and interesting stories to share. Yes, I did. Yes, I did, Cindy. Thank you. So any other comments or questions? And again, Sharon, if I didn't answer your particular question, just let me know if you had something else in mind, and we'll try to catch that before we go. So, all right. Well, I'm going to shut the video down. And if you have any questions, we'll just catch it in the dialogue. Thank you, Raylene. It's great to see you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat. And do join us, Bruce of Faith, next week. Hopefully they'll have the video fixed next week. I'm not exactly sure what was going on, but we're going to have a lot of fun. If you guys can drive in, it would be great to have you. So, all right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you here. We'll see you for the Yahweh Exists Book Club in 2 weeks. Have a great week.